Imagine you're a detective and the only witnesses to a crime are people who worship the suspect. Every account they give you is shaped by devotion. Some contradict each other. Some are writing decades after the event. How do you figure out what happened? This is the problem historians face with Jesus of Nazareth. The Gospels aren't neutral police reports. They're theological documents written by believers. Scholars cut through the theology to find history using a toolkit called the criteria of authenticity. So what's in the historian's toolkit? Two criteria tower above the rest. But before we get there, we need to understand the foundational problem. The Gospels were written 40 to 70 years after Jesus' death. The authors had theological motivations. And here's the critical point. Matthew and Luke both copied from Mark, and both independently used a second source scholars call Q, a hypothetical collection of Jesus' sayings. So when Matthew and Luke agree, that might reflect one source, not two independent witnesses. You have to map the source relationships before you can count witnesses. The first and strongest criterion, multiple attestation. When the same tradition appears independently in two or more sources, it's far more likely to reflect something real than something found in only one source. The anchor example is Jesus' prohibition of divorce. In Mark chapter 10, Jesus forbids divorce outright. In Q, preserved differently in Matthew 5 and Luke 16. The same teaching appears with different wording. That's a second independent witness. Then Paul, writing in 1 Corinthians 7, explicitly attributes this teaching to the Lord. And Paul's letters predate all four Gospels, three independent sources, three different literary contexts, one core teaching, that's powerful evidence. The second major criterion, dissimilarity. The logic is straightforward. If a tradition embarrasses or contradicts the theological interests of the early Christians who preserved it, they're unlikely to have invented it. People don't fabricate things that make them uncomfortable. Return to the divorce prohibition. Every writer who transmits Jesus' absolute ban immediately softens it. Paul adds exceptions for mixed marriages. Matthew inserts a clause allowing divorce for sexual immorality. The saying is more radical than the communities preserving it. They wouldn't invent a rule they couldn't follow. One important clarification, this criterion doesn't assume early Christians fabricated everything. It simply notes that traditions serving Christian interests could have been invented, while traditions cutting against those interests are harder to explain as inventions. When a tradition passes both criteria, multiple attestation and dissimilarity, the case is very strong. The divorce prohibition is the textbook case, but these criteria show up everywhere. Let's see them in action across several more traditions. First, the swords at Jesus' arrest. All gospel writers insist Jesus was peaceful and politically innocent, yet they preserve the detail that his followers were armed when he was arrested. Someone drew a sword and cut off the high priest's slave's ear. John even names Peter as the swordsman. A Jew carrying a sword at night during Passover in Jerusalem, following someone called King of the Jews, that was sedition in Roman eyes. Early Christians trying to prove Jesus was no revolutionary would never invent this detail. Second example, in Mark chapter 10, verse 18, someone calls Jesus good teacher. Jesus pushes back, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." This sounds like Jesus distinguishing himself from God, which directly contradicts later Christian theology that Jesus is God. Yeah? Christians confessing Jesus as divine would not fabricate a saying where he appears to deny his own divinity. They kept it because it was too well known to remove. Third, the inscription, King of the Jews, on the cross. It appears in multiple independent sources, passing multiple attestation, and it uses a title Christians never use for Jesus in their own worship, passing dissimilarity. It sounds like a Roman political charge, not a Christian confession. Let's see all the dissimilarity examples together. The pattern is consistent. In every case, there's a tension between what early Christians believed or wanted to portray and what the tradition preserves. The swords undermine their portrayal of a nonviolent movement. Mark 10:18 contradicts their core belief that Jesus is divine. King of the Jews uses a title foreign to Christian worship. The divorce prohibition is more radical than the communities that transmitted it. Each tradition survived despite being inconvenient. That recurring tension between the community's interests and the tradition's content is the fingerprint of historical memory rather than theological invention. Now flip the method. What does it look like when material fails the criteria? Matthew chapter 18 has Jesus giving detailed rules about church governance, how to handle disputes between members, when to bring matters before the church. He uses the Greek word ecclesia, meaning church or assembly. The problem, the church as an institution didn't exist during Jesus' lifetime. It developed after his death when followers believed he'd been raised from the dead. Organized communities with governance procedures emerged in the 40s and 50s. Matthew wrote in the 80s, "This is an anachronism, something placed in the wrong time period." Later, community concerns projected backward onto Jesus. The criterion of social coherence catches this. Material that doesn't fit a first-century Galilean Jewish peasant context is suspect. Notice the contrast. The divorce prohibition passes every test. 3 independent sources, a teaching more radical than the communities preserving it, and a perfect fit for a first-century Jewish context where divorce was a live debate. Matthew 18 fails. It reflects institutional structures that didn't exist yet, uses vocabulary from a later period, and serves the interests of the community that wrote it. Same gospel, same attributed speaker, completely different historical verdicts. The criteria don't treat all traditions equally. They saw evidence based on specific repeatable tests. Now that you've seen the criteria at work, let's put the whole framework together so you can use it yourself. Here's the decision framework. When you encounter any tradition attributed to Jesus, run it through 4 questions. First, how many independent sources attest it? Count only truly independent ones: Mark, Q, John, Thomas, Paul. Matthew and Luke copying Mark doesn't count as 3. Second, would early Christians have reason to invent this? If it embarrasses or contradicts their theology, it's more likely authentic. Third, does it fit the historical context of a first-century Galilean Jewish peasant, or does it reflect later institutional concerns? Fourth, and this is supplementary, is it coherent with material already established as historical through the stronger criteria? Let's trace one example through the full flowchart. King of the Jews on the cross. Multiple independent sources? Yes. It appears in Mark, John, and arguably other traditions. Would Christians invent it? No. It's a Roman political charge, not how they confessed Jesus. They called him Lord, Christ, Son of God, never King of the Jews. Fits first-century context, yes. Pilate executed people for sedition, and this is exactly the kind of charge Rome would post. Coherent with established material? Yes. It aligns with Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Verdict? Almost certainly historical. These criteria don't give us certainty. Nothing in ancient history does. They give us a principled, repeatable method for distinguishing what Jesus probably said and did from what later communities put in his mouth. Multiple attestation asks, how many independent witnesses? Dissimilarity asks, who benefits from this tradition? Social coherence asks, does it fit the time and place? Together, they turn theological documents into historical evidence. It's not about faith or skepticism, it's about evidence.